How you doing, guys? I have the 1776 report. We're going to do a little bit of reading here. We have an introduction. In the course of human events, there has always been those who deny or reject human freedom, but Americans will never falter in defending their fundamental truths of human liberty proclaimed on July 4th, 1776. We must, always hold these truths. The declared purpose of the President's Advisory 1776 Commission is to enable a rising generation to understand the history and principles of the founding of the United States in 1776, and to strive to form a more perfect union. This requires a restoration of American education, which can only be grounded on a history of those principles that is accurate, honest, unifying, inspiring, and ennobling, and a rediscovery of our shared identity rooted in our founding principles is the path to a renewed American unity and a confident American future. The Commission's first responsibility is to produce a report summarizing the principles of the American founding and how those principles have shaped our country. That can only be done by truthfully recounting the aspirations and actions of the men and women who sought to build America as a shining city on a hill, an exemplary nation, one that protects the safety and promotes the happiness of its people, as an example to be admired and emulated by nations of the world that wish to steer their government toward greater liberty and justice. The record of our founders striving and the nation that they built is our shared inheritance and remains beacon, as Abraham Lincoln said, not for one people or one time, but for all people and all time. Today, however, Americans are deeply divided about the meaning of their country, its history, and how it should be governed. The division is severe enough to call to mind the disagreements between the colonists and King George, and those between the Confederate and Union forces in the Civil War. The amount to dispute over not only the history of the country, but also its present purpose and future direction. The facts of our founding are not partisan. They are the matter of history. Controversies about the meaning of the founding can begin to be resolved by looking at the facts of our nation's founding. Properly understood, these facts address the concerns and aspirations of Americans of all social classes, income levels, races, religions, regions, and all walks of life. As well, these facts provide necessary and wise cautions against unrealistic hopes and checks against pressuring partisan claims or utopian agendas too hard or too far. The principles of our American founding can be learned by studying the abundant documents contained in the record. Read fully and carefully. They show how the American people have ever pursued freedom and justice, which are the political conditions for living well. To learn this history and become a better person, a better citizen, and a better partner in the American experiment of self-government, comprising actions by imperfect human beings. The American story has its share of missteps, errors, contradictions, and wrongs. These wrongs have always met resistance from the clear principles of the nation, and therefore our history is far more one of self-sacrifice, courage, and nobility. America's principles are named at the outset to be both universal, applying to everybody, and eternal, existing for all time. The remarkable American story unfolds under and because of these great principles. Of course, neither American nor any other nation has perfectly lived up to the universal truths of equality, liberty, justice, and government by consent. But no nation before America ever dared state those truths as the formal basis for its politics, and none have strived harder or done more to achieve them. Lincoln aptly described the American government's fundamental principles as a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated. But the very attempt to attain them, every attempt to attain them, would, Lincoln continued, constantly spread and deepen the influence of these principles and augment the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. The story of America is the story of this ennobling struggle. The President's Advisory 1776 Commission presents the first report of the intention of cultivating a better education among Americans in the principles of history of our nation, and in the hope of rediscovery of those principles in the forms of constitutional government will lead a more perfect union. Number 2 is the meaning of declaration. And I'm going to get some water. Okay. Thank you, everybody. All right. Number 2, the meaning of the Declaration. The United States of America is in most respects a nation like any other. It embraces a people who inhabit a territory governed by laws, administered by human beings like other countries. Our country has borders, resources, industries, cities and towns, farms, factories, homes, schools, and houses of worship. And although a relatively young country, its people have shared a history of common struggle and achievement, from carving communities out of vast, untamed wilderness to winning independence and forming a new government through wars, industrialization, waves of technological progress, waves of immigration, and political change. In other respects, however, the United States is unusual. It is a republic. That is to say, the government was designed to be directed by the will of the people rather than the wishes of a single individual or a narrow class of elites. Republicanism is an ancient form of government, but one uncommon throughout history, in part because of its fragility, which has tended to make republics short-lived. Contemporary Americans tend to forget how historically rare republicanisms have been, in part because of the success of republicanisms in our time, which is derived in no small part from the very example and the success of America. In two decisive respects, the United States of America is unique. First, it has a definite birthday, July 4th, 1776. Second, it declares from the moment of its founding not merely the principles on which its new government will be based, it asserts those principles to be true and universal, applicable to all men in all times, as Lincoln said. Other nations have birthdays. For instance, what would eventually evolve into the French Republic was born in 1789, when partisans stormed a hated prison and launched the downfall of the French monarchy and its aristocratic regime. The People's Republic of China was born in 1949, when Mao Zedong's China's Communist Party defeated the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War. But France and China, as nations, as peoples and cultures inhabiting specific territories, stretch back centuries or even millennia over the course of many governments. There was no United States of America before July 4th, 1776. There was not yet, formally speaking, an American people. There were instead, living in the 13 British colonies in North America, some 2.5 million subjects of a distant king. Those subjects became a people by declaring themselves as such, and then by winning the independence they had asserted as their right. They made that assertion based on the principle not blood or kinship, or what today might call ethnicity, yet this fact must be properly understood, as John Jay explained in Federalist 2. And here is the excerpt from there. Providence has been placed to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsel, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence. Yet as Jay and all founding fathers well knew, the newly formed American people were not quite as homogeneous in ancestry, language, or religion as this statement would seem to assert. They were neither wholly English, nor wholly Protestant, nor wholly Christian. Some other basis would have to be found and assert to bind the new people together, and to which they would remain attached if they were to remain a people. That basis was the assertion of the universal eternal principles of justice and political legitimacy. Here we have a quote from Abraham Lincoln. All honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times, and so to embalm it there, that today and in all coming days it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. But this too must be qualified. Note that Jay lists 6 factors binding the American people together, of which principle is only one. The most important or decisive one, but still only one, and insufficient by itself. The American founders understood that, for the republicanism to function and endure, a republican people must share a large measure of commonality in manners, customs, language, and dedication to the common good. All states, all governments make some claim to legitimacy. That is an argument for why their existence and specified form are justified. Some dismiss all such claims to legitimacy as false, advance to fool the ruled into believing that their rulers' actions are justified, when in fact those actions only serve the private interests of few. But no actual government understands itself this way, much less makes such a cynical claim in public. All actual governments rather understand themselves as a just and assert a public claim as to why. Understands themselves as just and assert a public claim as to why. At the time of the American founding, the most widespread claim was a form of divine rights of kings. That is to say, an assertion that God appoints some men or some families to rule and consign the rest to be ruled. The American founders rejected that claim, as 18 charges leveled against King George in the Declaration of Independence make clear. Our founders considered the British government of their time to be oppressive and unjust. They had no wish to replace the arbitrary government of one tyrant with that of another. More fundamentally, having cast off their political connection to England, our founders need to state a new principle of political legitimacy for their new government. As the Declaration of Independence puts it, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind required them to explain themselves and justify their actions. They did not merely wish to assert that they disliked British rule and so were replacing it with something they liked better. They wished to state a justification for their actions and their government to which it would give birth. That is both true and moral. Moral because it's faithful to the truth about things. Such a justification could only be found in the precepts of nature, specifically human nature, accessible to the human mind, but not subject to the human will. Those precepts, whether understood as created by God or simply as eternal, are given that man did not bring into being and cannot change. Hence, the Declaration speaks of both the laws of nature and of nature's God. It appeals to both reason and revelation as the foundation of the underlying truth of the document's claims and for the legitimacy of this new nation. The core assertion of the Declaration and the basis of the founders' political thought is that all men are created equal. From the principles of equality, the requirement for consent naturally follows. If all men are equal, then none may by right rule another without his consent. The assertion that all men are created equal must also be properly understood. It does not mean that all human beings are equal in wisdom, courage, or any of other virtues and talents that God and nature distribute unevenly among the human race. It means rather that human beings are equal in the sense that they are not by nature divided into castes with natural rulers and ruled. Thomas Jefferson liked to paraphrase the Republican political thinker Algernon Sidney. The mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their back, nor a favor few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. Superiority of talent, even the superior ability to rule, is not a divine or natural title or warrant to rule. George Washington, surely one of the ablest statesmen who ever lived, never made such an outlandish claim. Indeed, vehemently rejected such assertions made by others about him. Meaning, he said, even though everyone likes me, that I only have, I can't become the dictator. As Abraham Lincoln would later explain, there was no urgent need for the founders to insert into a merely revolutionary document this abstract truth applicable to all men and all times. They could simply have told the British king that they were separating and left it at that. But they enlarged the scope of their declaration so that its principles would serve as a rebuke and stumbling block to the very harbingers of a reappearing tyranny and oppression. The finality of the truth that all men are created equal was intended to make impossible any return of a formal or legal inequality, whether to be older forms such as absolute monarchy or hereditary or aristocracy, or to as yet unimagined forms we have seen in more recent times, which exists independently of the governed, whether government recognizes them or not. A bad government may deny or ignore natural rights, and even prevent the exercise in the real world, but it can never negate or eliminate them. The principles of the Declaration are universal and eternal, yet they were asserted by a specific people for a specific purpose, in a specific circumstance. The general principles stated in the document explain and justify the founders' particular actions in breaking off from Great Britain, and also explain the principles upon which they would build their new government. These principles apply to all men, but the founders acted to secure only Americans' rights, not those of all mankind. The world is still and will always be divided into nations, not all of which respect the rights of their people, though they should. When confronted finally the difficulty that the external principles elucidated in the Declaration were stated and became the basis for an actual government only a relatively short time ago, yet if these principles are both eternal and accessible to the human mind, why were they not discovered and acted upon long before 1776? Here we have a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise to all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In a sense, the precepts of the American founders were known to prior thinkers, but those thinkers stated them in entirely different terms to fit different political and intellectual circumstances of their times. For instance, ancient philosophers appeared to teach that wisdom is a genuine title to rule, and in a decisive respect all men are not created equal. Yet they also teach that it is but impossible for any actual living man to attain genuine wisdom. Even if wisdom is a legitimate title to rule, if perfect wisdom is unattainable by any living man, then no man is by right the ruler of any other except by their consent. More fundamentally, by the time of the American founding, political life in the West had undergone two momentous changes. The first was the sundering of civil from religious law, with the advent of widespread adoption of Christianity. The second momentous change was the emergence of multiple denominations within Christianity that updid Christian unity and in turn greatly undermined political unity. Religious differences became sources of political conflict and war. As discussed further in Appendix 2, it was response to those fundamentally new circumstances that the American founders developed the principle of religious liberty. While the founders' principles are both true and eternal, they cannot be understood without also understanding that they were formulated by practical men to solve real-world problems. For the founders' solutions to these problems, we must turn to the Constitution. Alrighty. Thank you guys for joining me today. I will be reading more of this book in other locations throughout DC. It was very nice to be here today and read this book to you guys, so please keep joining me in and we will complete the book throughout DC. Thank you guys. Have a good day.